We continue our work here at the Ukrainian Media Center, Ukraine Crisis Media Center. We now give the floor to Mr. Taras Kuzio, who is a PhD and represents the Department of Political Science of the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy. And he's a representative fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute of the School of Advanced International Studies.
About якраз через Міністерство інформаційної політики.
It was, here we have a representative of the Ministry of Information Policy, and it's with their assistance that my book was published. So I turn the floor over now to him. I represent the Ministry of Information Policy, and we have a special program on the publication of books and other editions for the eastern part of Ukraine. We have already published 175 books, mostly about the history of Ukraine, the history of the Crimean Peninsula, and they were aimed against some Russian media thesis ideas, and I'm glad to represent now Taras Kuzio, Mr. Taras Kuzio, who is a politologist and politology expert. He participated in the translation of this book, and so Mr. Taras is presenting this book today to the public. We are going to send this book to the units of the Ukrainian armed forces and to the schools, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine, so that they all read this book. What is important, says Mr. Kuzio, was that this book was also translated into Russian language, so that some of the members of the Russian public might be impacted, so to say, by this book. And
Here, Natalia Prylutskaya, with who... Прошу ставати, щоб не знали. Я з нею 2 рази поїхав на фронті, також.
With whom I twice went to the front line. And Ms. Natalia Prylutska, since 2014, has gone a number of times to the line of hostilities with the units of the self-proclaimed republics in what used to be the eastern part of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Natalia and similar women, their role is important, although many of them have never gone to the line of hostilities. For example, Ms. Tymoshenko never went there. Mr. Gritsenko, another presidential candidate, didn't go there, or hasn't go there. What's the background of this book?
2012, 2013. The book originally was going to be more about Donbass party regions, Viktor Yanukovych, because then Ukraine was ruled by a kleptocratic mafia regime, which was, of course, very pro-Putin, pro-Russian. And, but events, as always, like in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, events overtook the original project, because you had a Euromaidan, and then, of course, Russian annexation of Crimea, Russian military intervention, aggression in eastern Ukraine. So the project, which was like this, became like this. And hence, this is like 2 books, not 1 book, because this is 150,000 words, so it's about like 2 books in one.
It has more, the book has more than 500 pages.
Research was done by traveling throughout eastern and southern Ukraine. I was born in the Ukrainian diaspora, so therefore for me it was important to get to know Russian-speaking Ukraine, or on the whole Russian-speaking Ukraine, because there's obviously many stereotypes in the Ukrainian diaspora, but not only, about Russian speakers in Ukraine. But what was shown to me and what was shown in reality was that Russian speakers of Ukraine, absolute majority of them, are patriots of Ukraine. And this was why Putin's Novorossiya project failed. And I saw many Russian speakers on the front line, including in private sector, in nationalistic organizations, who were fighting and willing to die for their country. So I think this is something that Russia cannot understand. Russia to this day, i.e. Moscow, cannot understand your country, Ukraine. It does not understand it. It thinks it does, but its stereotypes about Ukraine are completely wrong, and I talk about this in the book, about Russian nationalist stereotypes. These have been around for over 100 years. They were the same in 1917 as they are today. There's no difference. They have not matured. They have not changed. Ukraine is a fake state. Ukrainians are a fake people. Ukrainians and Russians are the same. And majority of Ukrainians want to join Russia in the Ruski Mir, but they are prevented from doing so by these fascist West Ukrainians. So this has been around since the 1930s, and Putin and most Russians still believe this nonsense. So I did many visits, about 15 visits around eastern and southern Ukraine, 2 of them to the front line with Natalia, also with other friends to Mariupol, Volnovakha, and elsewhere. And I think that was very important because many people in the West, this period of time in Ukraine, Euromaidan and the war, is the most written about in the West about any time in Ukraine's history. There have been hundreds of books, articles in journals, media articles, academic articles about this conflict published in the English language. But 90% or more of the people who are writing this have never traveled to Ukraine, and especially have never traveled to the front line, which is, strange. So after 2014, the number of Ukraine experts grew like mushrooms after rain. But none of them are really proper Ukraine experts. I think that also many of these people ignore the real reason why there is a war, why Russia and Putin are conducting this military aggression, and why this will continue for a long time. I'm sorry to disappoint you, this will end soon. It won't. The reason is that most people ignore, and I do not, the focus of this book. The reasons I give for the war are that it's a question of national identity. And national identity changes slowly. I know this from my own country, Britain. It took 70 years or more, or 100 years, for British people to change their views of Ireland. And so it's the same with Russia. Russian views of Ukraine will not change soon. And they will not change if Putin dies or Putin is killed by a tiger he's fighting. There are many more Putins in Moscow. And the reason why this is national identity is because, as I mentioned, most Russians, majority of Russian people in Russia, I say not in Ukraine, in Russia, do not believe that you exist as a people, that Ukrainians don't exist. Putin has repeatedly said, we are one people, Ukrainians and Russians. That Ukraine is an artificial, failed state. That the majority of Ukrainians are really little Russians who want to join Russia in the Ruski Mir. So if you have this kind of viewpoint, then you are going to continue to believe that what is happening in Ukraine is wrong, and therefore it needs to be changed. And majority of the Russian mindset, Russian leaders, believe that they are not fighting Ukraine necessarily in Ukraine, they are fighting the West. This is a war against the West in Ukraine. And that Ukraine's leaders are basically Western puppets. This is how they kind of rationalize it. So the people in power are fascists from West Ukraine, oligarchs, and Western money. This is how the Russian views. So I don't think that this will change soon. Remember that also that Putin is president of Russia until 2024. This is also the same year which the next Ukrainian president will be in power till 2024. So it's very important that Ukrainians understand in the elections coming up that they are voting not only for a president, they are voting for a commander-in-chief. This is not a typical election. it's an election when 72% of Ukrainians, including 50–60% of eastern and southern Ukrainians, which is incredible, how it changed in Ukraine. 72% of Ukrainians, so nearly 3/4 of Ukrainians, think that their country is at war with Russia. So the views which were until 2014, 2013, only in Western Ukraine have become Ukrainian. They've become all Ukrainian. They're not just West Ukrainian anymore, these critical views of Russia. And therefore, if you are electing a commander-in-chief as well as a president at the time of war, a war that will continue for a long time, because Putin is president for life. Let's not, let's be serious about this. Putin will never leave office, except in a box. You cannot, in that mafia regime in Russia, leave the presidency while you're alive. It will be impossible. So Putin is president for life, and as long as Putin is president, there will be a war. And even, as I said, there are many more Putins in Moscow. So if you are electing also a commander-in-chief as well as a president, then you have to be sure who you are electing. I don't think a clown, a comedian, can be a good commander-in-chief. Can he? I don't think so. I'm not a Ukrainian voter, but I certainly would not be voting for a comedian to defend my country at the time of war. So I think that inevitably these elections are going to be very different. And I think when people go to the voting booths, they have to understand what they are voting for, and that this war will be for a long time. The book has, I would say, two parts. The first part is really the background. That's why I said it's two books. The background, which is Russian nationalist views of Ukraine, a discussion of this Russian nationalist emigres, Russian nationalist parties, Soviet regime, and its anti-Ukrainian propaganda. This Ukrainophobia we see in Russia is not new, not invented by Putin. It's been there since the 1930s and continued in the Soviet Union until 1990, this anti-Ukrainian propaganda there. And it's just been revived by Putin. It's the same slogans, the same views. So there's also a chapter on anti-Semitism, which is in the Soviet Union, it was called Anti-Zionism, but it's basically camouflaged anti-Semitism, which was very closely linked to Russian nationalism and to the Soviet regime. The Soviet regime propagated anti-Zionism in the 1970s and 80s, and Putin's regime and the DNR and LNR puppet regimes are also doing the same today. There's also chapters on the party regions, the history of Donbass, how it was a kind of Ukrainian Texas, a kind of a Wild West or Wild East from the late 19th century right through to the 1990s when there was a criminal civil war in Donetsk. There's a chapter on crime and violence, which I think is very closely associated. In the 1990s in Ukraine, the areas of Ukraine which had the greatest amount of criminal violence were Donbass, Odessa, and Crimea. It's not a coincidence. These are also areas which are closely linked to the party regions and their political kind of parties. The second half of the book is more to do with what's happened. So not background, so more what's happened. So discussing Russian military aggression against Donbass, what is hybrid war, and hybrid war is nothing new again. Putin did not invent hybrid war. The Soviet Union was doing hybrid war for many decades when the USSR existed, and it was conducting Putin's assassination of people in Britain or elsewhere. Again, is nothing new. The Soviet regime was doing this since 1926 with Petlura and Konovalets, Bandera, and Rebet. So again, Putin did not invent anything new. He's just revived the Soviet system. Annexation of these regions of Donbass, Crimea, a chapter on human rights and war crimes. We shouldn't forget, and I think you've published a lot on this question, that I think that there's not enough information said about this, about how the human rights and national rights are being persecuted. We hear a lot in the Western media about, the suffering of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine by these Ukrainian nationalists. Well, the Russian Orthodox Church continues to exist in Ukraine. It's a legal entity. Had to rechange its name, but it's a legal entity. There is no Ukrainian church, no Ukrainian Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox church in the DNR, LNR, or Crimea. They're all banned. And including Jews, fled from DNR to Ukraine. So I think these issues and issues of war crimes are very important. I know Ukrainian government is doing a lot in The Hague and international courts on these questions. And the final chapter is about national identity. I think one of the positive aspects of this conflict is that it has changed Ukrainians. And this change cannot be turned back. You cannot, it's not like a video recorder where you press rewind and you go back to pre-2014. Ukrainians have changed for good. In every conflict in history, every war in history, people are always changed by that. What happens in a war and conflict is that identity is more quickly changed. So what would change slowly over decades is changed very quickly over a few years. So despite Mr. Zelensky saying that Ukrainians and Russians are still brotherly peoples, this is not true. Majority of Ukrainians no longer believe that Russians are Ukraine's brothers. Because brothers don't annex your territory, they don't conduct military warfare and kill 15,000 of your people and create 1.7 million internal refugees. Brothers don't do that. So the fact that Zelensky still thinks that shows him to be a complete naive and little Russian candidate, in my view. Ukrainians have changed in many other ways. As I say, the views which were previously West Ukrainian only have now become all Ukrainian. And you see this in all the opinion polls about questions of history, how it's changed, identity, attitudes to language. Today, many people who previously called themselves Russians or said that they were Ukrainian Russian identity now say they are Ukrainians. They can still speak Russian, but they now say, no, I am Ukrainian now. It's my protest against what is happening. And today, 92% of Ukrainians, 92% of the people in Ukraine say that they are Ukrainians. This is a very high figure. Only 6% say they are Russians. So down from 22% in 1989. Amongst young people, it's 2% say they are Russians, which is, again, shows you the degree to which it's changed. And of course, I think the president's policies have been very good on questions like banning Russian social media. I agree with this, because these are all controlled by the Kremlin. And this has led to changes. So previously, young Ukrainians would be using VKontakte, and now they use Facebook, which is good, because VKontakte has been controlled by Putin since 2014. And other things like Yandex.ru and elsewhere. I noticed that many people now use Gmail, no longer .ru. So I think that the consequences of this war, and I'll finish soon so we can have some questions. The war, as I said, the war is going to be here for a long time. I'm sorry to tell you to be kind of pessimistic or realistic, but the war will not end soon. I don't think that Russia will have a democratic system in the near future. And even if Russia becomes democratic, which is a fantasy, of course, that won't necessarily change much, because it's very true when somebody said that Russian democracy ends at the Ukrainian border. Most Russian opposition leaders like Navalny support the annexation of Crimea. It's not just Putin does this. So I don't think this will change soon. But what's important is that which person will be leading Ukraine as president and commander-in-chief to face this Russian aggression. And thankfully today, as volunteers like Natalia will testify, today Ukraine, in 2014 that was not the case. Today Ukraine has an army, at least, and that's the first time in Ukraine's history Ukraine has an army. Could be still improved, of course, but the military-industrial complex has been revived. Ukraine receives arms from Canada, United States, Britain, and of course is building its own arms and building its own army. The next stage, of course, is rebuilding a navy because of the Azov crisis. I don't think that Russian views of Ukraine will change anytime soon. And so, again, that is another reason why the war will continue for a long time. This is the first time as well, I think, which is important in Ukraine, And it's the first time since 1991 that the Ukrainian authorities, the Ukrainian government, is actually supporting Ukrainian national identity. And we see this in your publications that you help, and in various other things, such as supporting Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, where Volodymyr Vyatrovich is ahead. I think these kind of issues, such as decommunization, are very important because it shows how Ukraine is different to Russia. When Ukraine became independent in 1991, and this building was the Lenin Museum then, in 1991, Ukraine inherited 5,500 Lenin monuments. That's only a bit less than Russia. In the Russian SFSR, there were 7,000. So the size of Russia had 7,000, Soviet Ukraine had 5,500. Today, there's not a single one left. So Mr. Darth Vader, Mr. Vyatrovich, has managed to get rid of those. But of course, they're not. They were removed in West Ukraine in the 90s, then Central Ukraine, then East and Southern Ukraine. But this is the opposite to DNR, LNR, Crimea, Russia, where you have re-Stalinization. Stalin is the god, Stalin is a new cult figure. So I think that's important to showing how Ukraine is moving towards Europe. Ukraine no longer celebrates Great Patriotic War, it celebrates World War II, like in Europe. So all of these to me are positive outcomes of aggression launched by Russia against Ukraine. I think also I'm more optimistic than many Ukrainians that Russian soft power has really ended in Ukraine. I don't think Russia has much influence left in Ukraine. You see this in the elections, for example, now. No pro-Russian candidate will go to the second round. Mr. Boyko, who is the most popular pro-Russian candidate, will come fifth, maybe fifth in the elections in the first round. This is very different to prior to 2013. Ukraine now has an Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Again, a very big accomplishment for President Poroshenko, I think, because the Russian Orthodox Church was never a church. It was an arm of the Soviet and then the Russian government. I think the progress that Ukraine's made in the last 5 years are very different to what was done under Yushchenko, which was very little. And also things like books, media, social media, the banning of these things coming from Russia has changed a lot. Ukraine, for the first time, Ukraine has an exhibition stand at the London Book Market this year. First time ever since 1991. Again, I don't know, are you involved in this London one? A little bit, yeah. It's important to show how Ukraine is a country which has its own publishing sector, publishing industry. And I think that I'll open it up to questions now, but I think that many of these important changes, such as including NATO and EU in the Ukrainian constitution, the Ukraine's agreement with the European Union, hopefully will continue after these elections this year. It's interesting that not all of the candidates included NATO and EU membership in their election programs. Certainly Tymoshenko and Gritsenko did not, surprisingly. Sadovey did, but he is no longer in the election race. So I think that the best answer to Russian and Putin's military aggression in Ukraine, against Ukraine, is to continue Ukraine's movement in the last 5 years out of the Russian world. And if you continue to do this, by 2024, you can say very easily to Mr. Putin, "До свидания, Россия." Thank you.
Шановні пані та панове, наразі маємо час для запитань. Прохання піднімати.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have now some time for questions and answers. Please introduce yourself when you ask questions. You mentioned this long protraction, so to say, of the hostilities, but you mentioned only two dates, 2019, 2024. What are the terms? I have not quite understood your question. But let me say that a lot of candidates use or resort to anti-war populism. Many of them say, if you elect me, I will finish this war. In my view, it's lies. Because if it does not mean a capitulation, it's not going to happen soon. One of the recent polls showed that 16% of the population of Ukraine said that they were ready to accept capitulation. But this, in my view, shows that the majority of the population is against capitulation. The number of candidates like Zelensky, Boyko, Tymoshenko, Hrytsenko, they are ready for capitulation, and Mr. Putin is not going to compromise. He is doing what I can call the Bosnianization of Ukraine. Therefore, he wants Ukraine to become federal state, not centralized state, to become weaker, to remain neutral as Finland or Austria, that it renounces the idea of joining NATO and the EU. But I do not know any of the candidates whom I would describe as pro-Western. Nobody of them, none of them would be ready, in my view, to capitulate. And we also have the veterans of this conflict, and I hope that they and their family members, they would oppose any moves of the Verkhovna Rada or the president to make peace, to capitulate to Russia. As far as this issue of peace is concerned, I understand that peace is better than war, but I'm sure that peace is not possible unless one is ready to capitulate, and I'm sure that the majority of the Ukrainians would not capitulate. Mr. Professor, Professor, don't you think that the Third World War has already started? And therefore, is the Russian Federation ready to use nuclear weapons?
He has no soul. He doesn't care about human life. And this is not just a question of Ukrainians or British people. In his first year in office in 2001, 150 Russian sailors died on the Kursk submarine. He didn't care about Russians either. His organization, the FSB, was behind the bombing of apartments in Moscow, so to help him be elected. They killed 300 Russians. If he's willing to kill Russians, he's willing to kill anybody else. He launched chemical terrorist attack on British soil with Mr. Skripal. So I think with Putin, if you are a Western policymaker, if you are a Ukrainian politician, Ukrainian president, you have to expect anything from him. Anything. And that is why I understand Poroshenko or the Ukrainian National Security Council when they introduced martial law. Because when that happened in the Azov Sea with the Ukrainian ships, on Bankova, they did not know if Russia was going to invade that night or tomorrow. Anything could. You have to be ready for any scenario. So I think it's very easy to criticize this. But if you are in charge of the country, you have to make very difficult decisions. If you want to read anything about that, read the minutes of the National Security Council meeting on the 28th of February 2014. They're available, published last week in Ukrainska Pravda. and where all these politicians like Tymoshenko and others spoke, Turchinov, Avakov, and you will see, because there is a real invasion. It's happening, end of February 2014. Crimea has been invaded by little green men. Tymoshenko was ready to give up. She said, don't mobilize troops. That would be provocative to Putin. Well, we know that this new defector who came from the DNR, this lady was an officer, I forget her name now. Хто це був цей, що втекла? No, це не має значення. She said that Russia has plans to invade Ukraine with 100,000 troops and it can be organized very quickly. That's what she said. So this is a real reality. So I think that, that if you are in charge of Ukraine, you have to take all of these different potential scenarios into account. That's what people do. That's what experts do. That's what political leaders do. With Putin, anything is possible, I think, with him. I think he's restrained in a bit because if he was to launch a big invasion of Ukraine, Ukraine is not Moldova or Georgia. This would not be easy to eat. It's too big, too many people, and Ukrainians will fight. South Ossetia is only 30 kilometers. The southern border of South Ossetia is 30 kilometers from Tbilisi. So it's very different. Donetsk is very far from Kyiv. And a majority of Ukrainians are patriots, they will fight. And we know that in 2014, many Ukrainians volunteered, and those volunteers had higher casualty rates than the army. And if it wasn't for those volunteers, civilian volunteers like Natalia, and military volunteers, Ukraine would, Russian troops would have been at Dnipro. So if Ukrainians were willing to die and fight in 2014, all Ukrainians, the highest number of casualties in Ukraine of soldiers is Dnipropetrovsk, not Lviv, Dnipropetrovsk. It's 4 times higher than any other oblast. So I think that Putin, they have to understand this. They're not completely crazy. Plus, Western sanctions would be complete. It would be disastrous for Russia if they would be even higher. And NATO would be on a state of war if Russia invaded Ukraine. So I think he's restrained. He's also, I think, restrained because Russians look at Crimea and Donbass differently. Crimea is a no-go. They will not negotiate. So again, going back to your question about peace talks, the only peace talks that Russia is interested in concern Donbass, not Crimea. Crimea is, for Putin, there is no discussion. So any Ukrainian politician who says that we want to have peace negotiations is, again, lying, because what are you going to do about Crimea? And some of them, like Viktor Pinchuk, wrote 3 years ago in the Wall Street Journal that we're ready to give up Crimea, then Russia will stop fighting in Donbass. If you believe that, you believe anything. Because you cannot believe Putin is a bigger liar than Goebbels in the Nazi regime. And nobody can trust, even in the West, what Putin says. So I think that, but what is different is that Donbass does not have strong importance in Russian national identity. In 2014, the most important cities for Russia were Kharkiv and Odessa. These are the big cities of so-called Novorossiya. But in Kharkiv and Odessa, Ukrainian patriots and Ukrainian nationalists defeated the pro-Russians. But Donetsk does not have the same importance in Russian identity. And that's why another reason why I think Putin has to hide his war in Donbass from Russians and to lie about it. Because his actions in Crimea are popular in Russia, in Donbass, less so, especially the number of people who were killed. I talk in here about 3, 4. The rate of Russian casualties in Donbass is higher than Soviet casualties in Afghanistan, because that was 15,000 over 10 years. So the casualties in Donbass over 4 years have been much higher for Russians. So is it a third world war? No, I don't think it is. But I think what's important, and I think the West only recently began to understand this, is that Russia thinks it's at war with the West. And this has been Russians have believed this, Putin has believed this for 10 years, more than 10 years. This all began after the Orange and Rose Revolution. And I talk about this in the book as well. If you read Putin's speech to the Munich Security Conference in 2007, he says everything. And then in 2007, same year, first cyber attack against Estonia. And then 2008, invasion of Georgia. 2009, expulsion of Russian diplomats from Ukraine, and Medvedev's letter to Yushchenko. So Putin believes that he's defending Russia and Eurasia against Western aggression. And so the best way to defend Russia is to attack the West. And he does this in, of course, different ways. The West only began to understand this, I think, in 2014 in Ukraine, and 2016, American elections, and then Skripal. Now the West understands this, but it took the West a long time. They were very naive about Russia, I think.
Ще запитання, колеги?
Any more questions, colleagues?
У мене два питання.
My name is Natalia, and I have two questions. My question is the following. Could Ukraine learn to live as Israel lives, for example, with regard to, restructuring, so meaning probably strengthening of its borderline? And this second question, it happens so that I communicate with a lot of people, and many people ask the following question. They think that international community does not help enough, does not help Ukraine enough. Does that correspond to your view? Because maybe we have different vision of this same issue, looking from here, from inside the Ukraine and from outside the Ukraine.
Ukraine gets a lot of financial support from the European Union, from Canada, United States, IMF, and World Bank. It also, unlike under Obama, under Trump, ironically, Ukraine receives weapons. I think President Poroshenko has done a very good job in lobbying for the West to continue sanctions against Russia. They are continuing, and those sanctions will continue as long as Russia continues to occupy Crimea, which means a long time. And also, I think that diplomatic support Ukraine gets as well quite strongly. I mean, of course, what helps as well is that Ukraine has to do things itself. It has to make reforms because there's no such thing as a free lunch. And that has happened in Ukraine. It's very different after the Euromaidan and after the Orange Revolution. It's very different. And Yushchenko, Tymoshenko just argued for 5 years, but at least things have been done. And there have been very quiet and good relations between the president, government, and parliament in the last 5 years. Не були такі сварки, як було тоді. And we can see who has supported those things in parliament. The strongest supporters of reform in parliament were firstly Narodny Front, secondly Poroshenko bloc, third Samopomich. Radical Party and Batkivshina did not support reforms in parliament. And Tymoshenko is a bigger critic of the IMF than the opposition bloc. So she's a contradiction in her foreign policy. She thinks that she can be pro-European Union and anti-IMF. You cannot be both. Because the European Union, Canada, and the United States only give financial support to Ukraine after Ukraine has signed an agreement with the IMF. So first the IMF and then Western governments. So if you're anti-IMF, then you are also anti-EU, anti-European Union. So I think that I think the sanctions could be a bit tougher. I think that nobody is happy with the Minsk agreements. But one has to understand, the president in 2014, Ukraine had no army in 2014. What was he supposed to do? If it wasn't for those volunteers, if you read any memoirs of those battles in 2014, the Ukrainian troops were not ready, except the paratroopers, такі десантники, наприклад, в Донецькому, Луганському аеропорті. But if there was the volunteers that saved Ukraine then.
Except for the paratrooper units who acted in Kharkov and the other regions.
Because Russia has a different view of the Minsk agreements. So, but you can't reject the Minsk agreements because then the West will stop the sanctions. So you have to keep pretending that the Minsk agreements maybe will be implemented, but they will never be implemented by Russia because Putin wants DNR and LNR back inside Ukraine so that the party regions, or the opposition bloc, sorry, can increase its votes. The irony of Russian aggression is that it removed pro-Russian voters from Ukraine. So 16% of Ukrainian voters live in Crimea, DNR, and LNR. And those voters in 2012, 2010 voted for Yanukovych and party regions. And that is why today they are very weak, those pro-Russian forces, because they cannot vote in Ukrainian elections. Your first question, please say again. Ще раз повторити перше питання.
Чи навчиться Україна жити?
Судомець.
Маючи такого сусіда, і якщо...
And your second question?
I think it's a difficult question, and I met somebody from the Israeli embassy a few months ago. We talked about this kind of thing. Israel is a much smaller country. It's surrounded by enemies. Well, not all of them now. Jordan and Egypt less so. But it feels surrounded. Ukraine is not surrounded by enemies. Only one country. Only Russia. Belarus is actually a good ally, a good friend of Ukraine today. Lukashenko.
Also big question.
Yeah, because Lukashenko does not want to have Russian troops invade Ukraine from Belarus, because then he does not know what will happen to his regime. Это мой колхоз, я не хочу это. So I think it's different. That's different. I think what's the same is that Israel was built on the back or after the Holocaust. And Ukraine has developed a strong memory of the Holodomor, which is similar. And 80% of Ukrainians believe the Holodomor is a genocide, including East Ukrainians. So 80%. And that is a product of 30 years of de-Stalinization in Ukraine. It began in the 1980s, and it's been continuing. And, with lots of publishing about this question. I think the identity of Ukrainians has changed completely since 2014. Russia does not understand this. Russia still is under the mythology, and people like Zelensky as well, on this that we are still brothers. They are not brothers. Most Ukrainians do not think that Russians are brothers anymore. And I think the biggest change in consciousness, Spidomist, has been for Eastern Ukrainians, not for West Ukrainians. My father is from West Ukraine. You did not have to convince him about Russians. Russians were never brothers to my father. But they were brothers for East Ukrainians. And that Stalinist mythology had been implemented in their heads for 50 years. But that's gone now. Not completely, but it's gone, I think. And especially for young people. So I think that it has changed. I mean, of course, as well, what's different is that in Israel, the war feels... Anywhere you are in Israel, you feel the war is close. Because a lot of soldiers walking around and with guns and everything. In Kyiv, it does not feel like there's a war. Or in Lviv especially. So it's kind of different. But I think that Russia... I wrote an article recently and said that Putin has lost Ukraine for good. If Putin hates Gorbachev because Gorbachev destroyed the USSR, Putin will be remembered in Russian history for having lost Ukraine. As Irina Bekeshkina said from Democratic Initiatives, he got Crimea and lost Ukraine. So I think it has changed, but of course. And I think also this is also related to the government and to the Ministry of Information Policy, that this is now a government or Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian parliament, president, which is supporting Ukrainian national identity for the first time, Ukrainian language, Ukrainian history, Ukrainian consciousness. This is the first time this has happened, really. Because Yushchenko talked a lot about this, did nothing, really.
Доброго дня. Скажіть, будь ласка.
Good afternoon. Can you please tell us if what are, in your view, the prospects of Ukraine, of the formation of Ukrainian nation? Because as we know, there are different ethnicities in Ukraine: the Hungarians, the Romanians, the Tatars. How to unite them into one political organism, and especially so in the conditions of what you described as the Russian aggression. So what are the prospects of the formation of Ukrainian nation? In my view, it already exists. If that nation didn't exist, the war would be lost by you yet in 2014.
Country in the world has regional divisions. Every country. Andrew just left now, he's Canadian. I lived in Canada also. It's a very regionally different country. America as well, United States as well. So the fact that Ukraine is made up of different regions, I don't think is necessarily a problem. I also think that one of the, and the last chapter of this book is about this question of national identity. The war has changed Ukrainians for good, forever. I don't think you can go back to pre-2013. It's not possible. When you've had bloodshed, it's impossible to go backwards. When so many people have been involved in the war. 15–20% of Ukrainians are veterans or related to people who are veterans. People, you know, when you go to cemeteries everywhere in Ukraine now, there's not only a section for the Second World War, there's also a section for this war. Young people. People go there at weekends to commemorate those young soldiers who died. So you can't change that. That brings the country together. I think that it's the number of Ukrainians number of people who live in Ukraine who say they're not Ukrainians is very low. 92% of Ukrainians, according to Razumkov Center recent survey, say that they are Ukrainians. So only 8% in Ukraine say they are not Ukrainians, of which 6% say they are Russians. That is a massive collapse in number of Russians. In 1989, the last Soviet census, there were 22% of Ukrainians, 22% of people in Soviet Ukraine were ethnic Russians. And then plus, I'm sure many of the people who said they were Ukrainians were also mixed Ukrainian-Russian. Today, it's completely different. And many people have moved away from saying they are Russians or Ukrainian-Russian, especially in eastern Ukraine. I think the biggest shock of this war has been for eastern Ukrainians. Not for, as I say, for West Ukrainians, and that change in their identity, they either could go this way towards supporting DNR, LNR, only a small number of people did, or they could go towards becoming more Ukrainian, because in a war and a conflict you cannot sit on the fence. Ви мусите вибрати сторону. Ви не можете казати, ну, я і Україна.
That is to say that the majority of the population in eastern Ukraine had to make their choice. They could not sit on the fence, so to say, and say that we are not against or for those and against those and those, both sides.
Speaking Ukrainians become normal. And remember, the Soviet regime and the Russian regime continually attack the Ukrainian language as kind of a peasant language, a fake language. So that also has changed. So I'm more optimistic than you are. Of course, not everything has changed. There's still, but only, if you look at opinion polls, only 16% of Ukrainians are willing to say, we will agree to peace at any cost. So capitulation, only 16%. And these are typically Boyko voters. Boyko, Morayev, Vilkul voters. But majority of Ukrainians, over 70%, said no. We demand first return of Crimea, end to military aggression, Russia pays compensation for war damages, and Russia stops interfering in Ukrainian affairs. 70% of Ukrainians say this. To me, this is a sign of a Ukrainian nation exists. Of course, there is still plenty of work to do, but as I say, this is the first time since 2014, the Ukrainian authorities, government, parliament, and president, for the first time at least, are supporting this building of Ukrainian national consciousness, and your ministry is doing a good job here on this. And this is very important. The government should be doing this. The government does this in every country. of the world. It supports national identity. So, anyway.
Ми маємо буквально кілька хвилин. Останнє запитання.
We only have a few minutes, so please, your last question.
Gone in a box somewhere. He's gone.
So you agree he lives in a box?
I hope he will live in a box in the nearest future.
Він
So
здохне, так?
I didn't say it.
Oh, you hope he will die, that Mr. Putin will die, or would die.
What do we have to expect, and what do we have to do in this short period when they are going to change their one phase to other phase? Because I think that we don't have too much time in this process. Yeah, we need to be very fast. Let's say. Thank you.
Well, I mean, if you are an expert, if you are a government policymaker, advisor to the president, you of course have to be ready for every scenario. And this is one of the potential scenarios. What is life going to be like after Putin? But I don't think much will change. And nothing will change on the Crimea, for certain. Because for Russians, this is a non-question. Donbass, possibly. I think the one thing you could maybe say more optimistic would be that if people like, Navalny is a liberal nationalist. He's not a Democrat, he's a liberal nationalist. If people like Navalny came to power, they could still have those Russian chauvinistic views of Ukraine, but they would no longer conduct military aggression. So Yeltsin was also, not very friendly to Ukraine. It took Yeltsin 3 years before he traveled to Ukraine to sign a treaty with Kuchma, even though Kuchma was pro-Russian when he was elected in 1994. So Yeltsin was also similarly, and in the 1990s, the Russian parliament continually made territorial claims against Crimea and Sevastopol. But there was no military aggression by Yeltsin against Ukraine. The first military aggression was Tuzla by Putin in 2003 and then 2014. So I think that could be potentially in Ukraine's favor. But those kind of views that Russians have of Ukraine and Ukrainians, which I talk about in the book, they're very deep, and they will not change soon. The idea that the Russian view that Ukraine is really just a part of Russia. I mean, and a lot of this is based on Russian theft. They've stolen Ukrainian history. I mean, it's ridiculous that in Moscow 3 years ago, Putin unveiled a monument to Vladimir the Great. Moscow did not exist when he ruled Kyiv Rus. But, for them to change all this in their history would mean Russians to accept that they are the younger brothers and you are the elder brothers. And I think that's something, I remember the really funny story from 1994 when Dmytro Korchinsky, who was the head of UNSO, said to Zhirinovsky, let's create an Eastern Slavic state, Eastern Slavic Union. And Zhirinovsky said, great, yes. But Korchinsky said, but the capital city is Kyiv, not Moscow. And Zhirinovsky said no. So I think you have to be ready for every scenario in Moscow, but I'm not so optimistic about Russians changing their views of Ukraine very time soon. And so a lot of the things which have happened in the last few years, like Ukraine spending a lot of money on the army, Ukraine building an army, keeping a big army, will have to continue. And Ukraine will have to learn to defend itself in other areas, cyber warfare, navy, and elsewhere, because this Russian threat will not go away very soon. And it's a threat to the West as well. It's not just to Ukraine. I mean, the American national security doctrine says that Russia is a bigger threat than Islamic terrorism. So thank you, Putin, for doing that.
На жаль, ми обмежені у часі, тому пропонуємо продовжити вам спілкування зі спікерами поза межами прес-зали. Бажаємо всім гарного дня. Дякуємо.
Дякую за
we have exhausted our time, so thank you for your attention, and good day to you.